Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 6, The 35th Day of Planting, Part 2 of 5. "This is madness," Thorne exclaimed, looking around the second resting station. According to the estimates of his officers, there were only 30,000 soldiers who made it back from the temple debacle. The rest were somewhere in the vastness of Salem. "We need to march west," Thorne bellowed. Obviously that was the correct direction all along. Who was the slagging Zenas who said otherwise? Major Twigg shrugged. "We can send men out to look for the missing soldiers, then tomorrow we march west." Thorne grunted. He looked over at Sergeant Major Healy, who had never regained his color from last night. "Recommendations, Poe." "Whatever you want, General," he said dully. There was one thing on Poe's mind, ever since he saw Mari Shin fall. It most likely was the slagging Zenas who spread the rumor that sent the army to find nothing in the north. If it was, he also set up Mari to die. It was just like Shem. He did it to Poe, too, years ago. Instead of going down himself to Idemia to deliver the message to the Shins that Edge was in trouble, Zenas asked Poe to do it. Of course, he said that Poe could turn down the request, but Poe knew better. He was the newest recruit, the skinniest man, and most importantly, he knew how to steal horses. Zenas had even said he'd be willing to try to go, but wasn't sure if the messenger's horses could carry his weight. Poe really had no choice. At the time, he was eager to do it, to prove his worth to the Shins. He and Zenas had spent several days rebuilding their bedroom while talking and reminiscing about Mari's after-school care. Poe had even confessed to Zenas his deepest worries, his greatest crimes, and his darkest fears about the future. Zenas had been, or at least seemed to be, most understanding. He told Poe he could make a new future for himself. He could fix his past wrongs by being the best man he could in the future, and that Perrin Shin would always be there to help him. And then Poe agreed to steal those horses all the way to Idemia. True, he delivered the message in record time. And true, he even gained a bit of fame himself with that play about the colonel. But for his thievery, which Zenas told him he needed to stop, then asked him to do just one more time, he was sent away from Edge. Perrin Shin wasn't his commander anymore. Grasses proved to be a good fort, but Edge would have been better. Poe couldn't get Jatesi's words out of his mind. "My mother always thought of you as a lost son." If Poe had been able to stay in Edge, maybe Mari and Perrin would have taken him with them to Salem. He had nothing left in the world. His parents didn't care about him, and the few girls he tried to love didn't reciprocate his feelings. Everything would have been different. It should have been Shem Zenas who rode to Idemia, who was transferred to Grasses, or at least should have stood last night at the temple waiting for Lemuel Thorne. There was no doubt in his mind. Shem Zenas was still alive. Lemuel's stories were falling apart. And it was Shem's fault that Mari Shin was dead. Once again, Zenas the coward made someone else do the job he was too scared to do. Zenas and a sword might have had a chance against Lemuel Thorne. But Miss Mari, what were they thinking? Poe didn't even get a chance to say goodbye to her. He didn't even know if she recognized him in the brief moment that their eyes met. He thought maybe she did, and if she had, for some reason, he still heard her words in his head. "What color is the sky, Poe? See that it's not what they've told you it is. What color is the sky, Poe?" He knew the truth now. She never did betray her husband. He knew it by the way the colonel referred to her in his dream. He still loved her, deeply. She had always been faithful to Perrin, and for that, Poe loved her even more. But Shem Zenas? Poe hated Shem Zenas. But there was now one man he hated even more. Lemuel Thorne, the man who literally broke Mari Shin's heart. Wait, I'm getting confused, Versa said. So he knew you gave your name originally as Pear Shin, but he thought your real name was Lek Brighter? Then he changed your name when he claimed you in front of everyone before the Battle of Idemia? Young Pear nodded. Yep. Started calling me Corporal Lek Thorn. A few weeks later, he promoted me to Lieutenant Lek Thorn. Versa flapped her lips in disgust. So what was the name you had made for yourself before he changed your name? Young Pear hesitated. I'm afraid to tell you. Why? That bad? Just about. I won't laugh, I promise. You better not. Young Pear cleared his throat. I had changed it to Swordmaster Thorn Shin. She broke her promise. What? She burst out, holding her sides of her belly as she laughed. That sounds like something an 11-year-old would make up. Young Pear shook his head at her, but he knew he was smiling, then grinning, then finally laughing. The sound surprised him. He hadn't heard himself laugh for much longer than he could remember. It felt wonderful. Versa wiped her eyes. So, tell me the story behind that. There's got to be one. I did make up the name when my brothers and cousins and I were playing the world with sticks we used like swords, he confessed. But only when my grandfather and Uncle Shem were not around. We gave ourselves designations. I called myself the Swordmaster of the Cosmos. Oh, that's awful, she snickered. How old were you? Young Pear blushed as he confessed, 14. They both laughed. Versa held her belly tighter. Stop, it's too much. I need to relieve myself again. 14? I was sure you were younger. Just acted younger. My life at 14 was considerably different than yours, he chuckled, and the smile stayed on his face. It had missed using those muscles. You know, the general got pretty close to the truth. A couple of times I became confused as to who I was and who he thought I was. My real name was Pear Shin, but no one believed that. And General Thorn was right. I was Pear Shin's grandson, just not Jatsi and Dex, or his son. Unbelievable. Did you ever make mistakes, get confused? Oh, yeah. One time I was pretending to see your great-grandfather Cush. I was thinking about my grandfather's uniform, the one he pulled out every year, and I remembered the brass buttons on it. I'd forgotten that uniforms no longer had brass buttons, and most of the soldiers wouldn't have known, but the older ones did. Captain Nelt hadn't told me about the buttons, and he confronted me about that. I bet that made you nervous. Definitely. But fortunately, he was more nervous than me. By the time we got to the Pools Fort, there were so many stories circulating about me, no one was quite sure what to think. Some of the officers thought I was Jatsi's son and maybe even the general's real son as well. Others thought I was the original Pear Shin and come back. Some of the soldiers thought I was some kind of embodied ghost at worst, or Lemuel Thorne's long-lost nephew at best, even though he never had siblings. He hesitated, not so sure that was entirely true. But Versa chuckled. And what did you tell people you were? That I was a distant relation of Deckett Brighter and forgot my real name when I enlisted. Then after the general claimed me, I was his son. Versa rolled her eyes. Ugh, and I thought I got confused when my name was Darryl. Young Pear grinned. I never tried passing myself off as a woman. Maybe I should have tried that as well. Versa grinned back. You would have been the largest, scariest woman anyone would ever have seen. Now that would have provoked a few nightmares. They both laughed as they walked, and Young Pear watched her out of the corner of his eye. She was watching him, too. So, she started again. After the battle at Pools, off to Idemia then? Young Pear nodded. The general left the next morning to claim his mansions. Versa was quiet for a moment, and then when she spoke, her voice was cold. Sargon was a cockroach. Someone should have crushed him years ago. After he betrayed General Karna, then killed my uncle and Aunt Fadi, her voice cracked. It took her another moment to compose herself again. Once the Fods were gone, it was the end of everything for us. All because Sargon wanted everything for himself. She cleared her throat, her tone still icy. Rumor was it that his daughters were very beautiful. Did they live up to your expectations? Young Pear shrugged, trying to understand her sudden change of tone. But then he understood. I didn't go with him, Versa. I'm not that kind of a man. Really? Young Pear stopped walking. She stopped mid-stride and looked back at him. Really, he said firmly. In fact, I headed back to Edge the next day, much to the general's disappointment. I knew what he wanted me to do in Idumea with Sargon's daughters, but as I said, I'm not that kind of a man. General Perenshin would never have tolerated such abuse in his ranks, and I still wanted to be a General Shin. Good, she whispered, and continued walking again. In 3 quick strides, Young Pear was back by her side. But how could you be General Shin when your name was Lek Thorn? He shrugged again. Lots I didn't have figured out, but assumed somehow it would all work itself out. But the world is never that convenient, Versa declared. They continued on in silence before Young Pear found a way to break it. So, Versa, in a way, it's appropriate that I escort you to the temple site. Since I was claimed, I guess I must be your brother. Or cousin. But then again, I didn't exactly accept the claiming, but Slither told me once it wasn't necessary. What stupid laws! Then again, look at who came up with them. She glanced over to him. So, Young Pear, if I may know, why did you leave Salem in the first place? Young Pear sighed. For dumb reasons. I was bored. I wanted something different to do. I told myself I left to clear my family's name, but that wasn't really true. Eltana wanted vengeance, and I felt like I was being denied something by being trapped in Salem. You know the saying, the cows are always fatter in the neighbor's field? That's what I thought. The world had to be better than what I had in Salem. I also wanted to feel some of the glory I thought my grandfather and uncle had experienced. The army was so romantic, I guess. Sounds ludicrous now, but I was a rather stupid boy. I see that now. I guess it was all just a selfish temper tantrum that I took too far. I'll say too far, she agreed. You know, he decided to confess, because he needed the practice. The strange thing is, all the time I was in the world trying to get everything I wanted, I was miserable. I just realized now that the happiest I've ever been since I left was when I was taking care of my security team these last few days. And I think I know why. I wasn't focused on myself. I was focused on taking care of others, making sure they had comfortable ways to sleep, teaching them about Salem's ways, keeping track that none of them got lost. I was never so happy as when I quit thinking about myself. Huh, Ursula said thoughtfully. Sounds like you've come up with the world-shattering way of thinking about life. Too bad there isn't an entire society like that, all devoted to helping each other, where no one is more important than someone else, and where even the man in charge doesn't employ servants but stables his own horse. Huh, if only one could find such a place. To be honest, he was slightly annoyed by her sarcasm, after he just confessed what he considered was a deep and important insight to his life. But his annoyance meant that he was being selfish once more, and grudgingly he had to admit to himself that she was right. Again. He glanced over to see her smirking. So, let me see if I've got this straight, she said in a critical tone coated in syrup. You not only had a mother who loved you, but a father who actually cared for you and wasn't out to kill you. Young Pear nodded guiltily. You never dug food out of rubbish heaps, well, not more than once, that is. I spent a lot more time chasing women and children away from them so I wouldn't have a mess to clean up. Versa peered over at him. Chasing away families like mine. Yes, he said quietly. And again, I apologize to you and all the families in the world that soldiers pulled a sword on. Versa nodded once. You also never moved houses, always had your own bed. Even my own bedroom. Once Ralph married and Barnes took his room, he supplied with a wince. Ralph's the one I met last year, right? Yes, the one who came to retrieve me. Versa nodded. I liked him. Very nice man. Sincere, concerned, helpful. Hard to imagine he's your brother. Are all of your siblings and cousins as selfless as him, willing to leave their family and home for weeks just to search for someone who didn't want to be found? Pretty much, yes. You poor, poor boy, she bubbled. However did you tolerate such a life? I can see why it simply wasn't good enough for you, why you felt the need to leave it all. Young Pear rubbed his forehead. This wasn't exactly the kind of humbling he was expecting, but while it was painful to hear himself described that way, it wasn't unbearable. In a strange way, it actually made him feel better to get it all out. At least Versa was a good practice for what might come when he finally met his father. I was foolish, I know. Versa nodded. Yes, incredibly foolish. Thanks for the confirmation, just what I needed to hear. Versa nudged him with her elbow. But what matters is what you understand now and what you've learned. Salem's taught me that one's past stays in the past. You sound like a different man now, and I dare say you may even have potential. Thanks again, Young Pear said, more genuinely. You're welcome, she said. I suppose I was a bit quick to question the Creator's choice in sending you to escort me. You may be adequate, after all. So tell me more about your childhood. What kind of mischief did Sword Master of the Cosmos get into? Young Pear groaned. They still had many miles to go. The sun bathed the ancient temple site in cheery light, but the air was cold as Calla Travato Zenus was lowered into the grave. Shem couldn't speak. One of his assistants gave a sweet tribute that was relayed throughout the area. Nor could Shem bring himself to pray over her grave. He only mumbled to Lek that he felt unworthy, and asked his oldest son to do it. Lek knelt to ask protection for his mother's resting spot, as the rest of the family and thousands of more Salemites listened and quietly wept. Shem sat on the ground, braced up by his daughters, as the shovelfuls of gravel and rock, mixed with a little dirt, were thrown over her body, shielded only by the white blanket. In all of their preparations for the last day, no one had ever considered someone would pass away up there. None of them had thought of bringing coffins. When they finished the burial, Shem could do nothing else than stare at the pile of rubble. Dek then gave a moving tribute to his mother-in-law, since neither her son nor daughter had any strength to do so. His words were also relayed throughout the tableland, to more tears and sniffles. No one dared guess what happened to her body, left at the temple where Idumean soldiers surely wouldn't give it a respectful burial. Ralph carved that morning, as hastily but neatly as he could, a marker out of wood. On it were the words, Calla Travato Zenus, 308-365. In memory of Mari Pedo Shin, 291-365. The 35th day of planting was going to be another very long day. Even if Young Pear and Versa weren't so engaged in swapping tales to prove whose youth was more trouble-filled, nibbling on dried fruit and elk jerky from her pack as they walked, they still wouldn't have noticed the two figures in white, just outside their field of perception, who walked behind them, hand in hand, listening, smiling, and whispering to each other. Nor would they have realized that 3 additional couples in white took position around them, securing a wide perimeter which no soldier dared or even thought to infiltrate. That was good, because Young Pear and Versa didn't seem to notice anything beyond each other. You did what you were supposed to do, Jatsi whispered to Shem as he sat by the gravelly grave. His assistants had taken over for the day, and no one was supposed to approach him except for family. Shem didn't look at her, even though she sat right in front of him. His glazed eyes focused on nothing. I felt them, Shem, both of them, Jatsi said earnestly. They are well and happy and so terribly worried about you. It's not your fault. They want you to know that. It was simply their last day. You did the right things. Shem stared past her, refusing to believe any of it. Are you telling me you can only find another 10,000? Thorne roared at his officers who stood before him. It's midday meal. Where's the rest of my army? The officers glanced at each other. Many have abandoned the army, sir, one bravely explained. The ones we spoke to are convinced Mari Shin is going to get them, too. They're throwing down their weapons and running away when we approach. It's true, sir, said a colonel, his tone bitter. They're scared and hiding in barns and sheds, waiting to die. We've heard reports of soldiers taking their own lives rather than waiting for death to come find them. And we found a few hundred who are trying to organize to return to Edge. And guess who's helping them? John Offra. Now, we may be able to find a few thousand more by tonight, but General, you'll be lucky if you have 40,000 to march with. Major Twiggs squinted, clearly unaccustomed to the idea of soldiers disobeying the commands of the general. But even with the men we lost along the way, we had close to 70,000 at the temple last night. Yes, we did, the colonel said abruptly. Then the long-dead Mari Shin suddenly appeared. Then the chosen guide died. Then General Thorne killed a defenseless old woman. Then there was no secret entrance in the temple, and there were no Salemites hiding in the canyon. Thorne stepped up to him. What are you insinuating? The colonel whipped off his cap and threw it on the ground. That it's time to follow another colonel's example. I'm finding Perrin Shin. He's dead! Thorne shouted. I found his grave marker myself. He died 2 years ago. Healy's head shot up in surprise. The rest of the officers stared at the general, dumbfounded by the news, and that Thorne exposed his own lie. Everything was falling apart. Everything they had believed in, been told over and over until they accepted it, wasn't true. Next thing, someone would tell them the sky wasn't really blue. I don't care, the colonel said sullenly. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm finding me a nice flock of sheep somewhere. Plenty of them wandering around. John Offra can probably give me some directions. He turned his back on Thorne and headed for the door. The other officers twitched, wondering if they should follow, but also half expecting the general to run through the defecting colonel with the sword. But Thorne seemed a little less thorny today, perhaps a little surprised himself that things were not quite going his way. All he did was yell after the colonel, I'll tax you so heavily that you'll be left with only one old ram. The colonel waved a sloppy goodbye, adding a vulgar flourish before slamming the door behind him. Thorne glared at the other men. None of them moved. Find the rest of my army! They filed out of the station slowly, Healy the slowest of all. Sergeant Beavid was waiting for the first complaint. His men had been relatively quiet, but the valley stretched out for miles. It was Teach who finally said it, and Beavid wasn't at all surprised. This is going to take forever. How far away are those mountains? We're not getting any closer. Yes, we are, Teach, Reg said patiently. We've probably covered 6 miles by now. Snarl looked with disgust at the last of his rations in his hand. I'm sick of this stuff. Let's find a house and get a decent meal. Beavid sighed loudly. We've already agreed. We're not going to raid any houses or act like soldiers. Well, we look like them, Snarl pointed out. Who's going to know? We'll know, Reg snapped at him. Snarl blinked in surprise at Reg's sudden gumption. Besides, Reg said more timidly, already backing down. There aren't any houses around here. Just this forest and these fields. Yeah, what's the point of this? Pal asked, looking around. This whole swath of land just left completely untouched. From one end of the valley to the other along the river, it looks like no one's ever disturbed it. It looks natural, Teach said with a slight shiver. Yes, it does, Beavid agreed. I think I rather like it. Teach shrugged. They better have a full dinner waiting up there. My rations are gone. Beavid wished he had taken a sample of that applesauce when he had the opportunity. His stomach rumbled. Suddenly, Teach gasped. The rest of the men turned to see him gesturing feebly to the edge of the trees. They blinked, then blinked again to make sure their eyes were functioning properly. About 40 paces away was something that looked like a deer, but was much more massive than what the world was used to seeing darting through the farms. It was rubbing its antlers against a large tree trunk, as if its enormous rack was itchy. What is that? Reg whispered. Teach tried to answer. Wah, wah, wah. Beavid frowned. Wah? Stupidest song I ever heard, Snarl snarled. Whoppity! Teach finally exclaimed. The men were duly amazed. Elk, right? Hammer asked. Shin said they were delicious, didn't he? I wonder what elephants taste like, Iron said, licking his lips. Buddy and Pal glanced around nervously in case one was sneaking up on them. No way to hunt it, men, Beavid said sadly, and I feel like we're running out of time anyway. I can hunt it, Snarl insisted, slowly stalking toward it. But the elk stopped its rubbing and gave Snarl such a conscious and deliberate look that he stopped in his tracks. The elk watched him for a moment before striding purposefully along the edge of the trees past them. Even Snarl seemed taken aback by its confidence. Yeah, we're running out of time, he said. Beavid started on again. But maybe there's jerky up at the ancient temple site. Everyone followed Beavid, but Teach still couldn't move. He was right, he mumbled. About Wapiti? Salem? He was right. He might have been right about everything. Beavid turned around. Every moment I'm more and more convinced young Pear was right, Teach, which means we better get up to that ancient site and soon. I don't want to be on the wrong side whenever the last day is. Teach jumped a little, nodded respectfully to the bull elk, still unconcerned with him, and jogged to catch up. You're really going to have to help me, Versa said, blinking rapidly, because I really want to understand this. Young Pear had offered the explanation in the past, but with poor results. I mean, Versa sighed, I understand wanting to be different, but why would you think a badger would be a great pet? Well, Mugga told us to write about an unusual animal as a pet, so I chose a badger because I think they're cute. Cute and vicious? But then why would you get one drunk on old berries and smuggle it into your bedroom as a pet? That's the stupidest experiment I've ever heard of. He shrugged. I told you before, I didn't think things through very much, especially when I was 12. And so it woke up earlier than you expected while you were doing your homework in the eating room? She reminded him. Yep, he sighed sadly, and proceeded to stink up everything Barnos owned. He shared the bedroom with me at the time. I can see why he didn't come to retrieve you in Edge, she chuckled. No, Ralph came because he looks the least like a Shin. Barnos favors my Shin grandparents too much. Sure, that's why. Young Pear's gait slowed, seeing things from different angles, and suddenly rethinking everything he knew about himself. I guess he would have been pretty mad at me. About a lot of things, really. I wasn't the easiest brother to live with. Ralph was always the peacemaker in the family. But we're good now, Barn and me. He married and moved out before I left, so I'm sure all is forgiven. But it was a lot to forgive over the years of having to live with the most difficult brother in Salem. And as young Per reflected, he realized there was even more that his siblings and cousins had had to put up with. Versa, who forged ahead, hadn't realized that young Per was trailing behind. Nor did he, too overwhelmed with the many, many times he'd aggravated his family, caused another near disaster, or had another mishap that required all of them to drop what they were doing and run to his rescue. He remembered playing bad men, good men with Cephas and the boys, and recalled how often he endangered all of their lives, that he truly was a bad man, and that Cephas was always a good man. He stopped walking and squeezed his eyes shut tight in regret for all the times his pride and selfishness had forced everyone to accommodate him. And how often had Cephas tried to swing things back again? How many times had Cephas proven to be the opposite of young Per, in calm and restraint and help? How often had Cephas been the kind of boy young Per should have been? "Hey!" he heard Versa call from ahead. "What's wrong? Are you coming or not?" He opened his eyes. "Tell me, honestly, how many arrogant people have you known that you actually liked?" She frowned at the unusual question and started back to him. "Liked? Probably none. No one likes an arrogant person. They may tolerate them, but like them? Never." "That's what I was afraid of." He had been the most arrogant Salemite to have ever lived. He thought he'd had admirers by the dozens, but maybe no one cared for him at all. If he hadn't been handsome and charismatic, no one would have put up with him. And those who got to know him better, like his family, saw right through his Mr. Charm persona. They knew all too well that he was Mr. Arrogance, and no one likes an arrogant person. As she got closer, he confessed in a small voice, "They used to call me the little lieutenant in Edge because they said I strutted around like a rooster." She must have seen the anguish in his eyes because she didn't have a snappy comeback. Instead, she said, "I have not seen you strut once today. Officers are, by nature, arrogant creatures. But you're no longer an officer. You weren't even one really legitimately, either." "Makes it worse." She shrugged that off. "So what? That's not what you are anymore, right? You're not that haughty officer, nor are you that reckless boy, right?" His next words came out as a whisper. "But they don't know that." "They who? Oh, wait, your family?" He nodded, embarrassed that he was revealing such things to her. But Pugga said he needed to be humbled. "Everyone's an idiot when they're young," she declared. Not Cephas, he thought. When he didn't answer, she said, "It doesn't matter, young Per. They'll see who you are now. I heard your father speak to my mother about you a few times. He never said you were arrogant. I only heard him express his deep concern for you and say how much he missed you. It'll be all right. Your past gets to stay in the past. That's what I've learned in Salem." He wasn't so sure, but he knew he was wasting time and feeling sorry for himself, and only arrogant, selfish people hinder progress. That wasn't him anymore, but he was worried that it was. "Sorry, I shouldn't be holding us up. Let's keep walking." "Eat, Papa," Huldah said gently. "Please." She held out a wooden plate. Salemites had been bringing food all morning, hoping to find something in their rations to tempt the guide. Esther and Huldah had filled a plate with all of his favorites. It was well past midday meal now, and still Shem didn't move, didn't drink, and certainly didn't eat. He just stared at the pile of gravel. Young Per watched as Versa whipped out the knife, slashed through the thorny shrub in their way, and slipped the knife back into her waistband almost faster than young Per could follow the movement. That's amazing in a scary sort of way, he chuckled nervously. Versa smiled slyly and stepped through the gap she had cut. You should be scared. I terrified more than one soldier when I was in the world. Young Per stared at her as a thought came to him. Versa turned. The thorns aren't bad, just get past them. He slipped through the gap, but still stared. Are you the slashing? He didn't want to use the word that completed the title soldiers had created. Versa narrowed her eyes. The slashing what? Young Per swallowed. There was a story that went around the fort about a girl who hung around certain entrances, willing to entertain soldiers on an individual basis. His voice trailed off as he looked into her eyes. They were hard and impenetrable. Go on, she insisted. Young Per cleared his throat. Supposedly, she would lure men into a barn or a stand of trees in the guise of making herself available to them. Once they lowered their, he struggled to find an appropriate word, guard, she would slash them and steal their silver and gold slips, leaving them bleeding and robbed. Versa continued to stare back, not even blinking. She had an army-issued long knife, according to the rumors, Young Per said a little anxiously. No one ever got what they expected when they were alone with her. Versa finally blinked. Not what they expected, but what they deserved. They cared nothing for the girls they used up and left. They deserved to be used back. He took a cautious step back. It was you, wasn't it? She looked down. I'm not proud of it, but I had no choice. Do you know how hard it is for a single woman to find a way to support a family of 4? Everything I did was to help my mother, since her husband never would. I told my mother I was working for a farmer tending his swine. In a way, it was the truth. Each of those men was a pig. But I confessed all of my indiscretions to my rector when I got here, by the way, she said, looking back up at him. But I also have to admit, I would have done it again. My mother needed the money, and I hated the soldiers. Everything they stood for, the man they followed, the way they thought they could abuse girls and women. I was trying to get back at my father by attacking his soldiers. I only did it 8 or 9 times before we moved from coast to mid-plain. Young Per coughed. 8 or 9 times? I heard it was hundreds, and at almost every fort. Then again, you know how soldiers like to exaggerate. They did say she was a beautiful blonde. That wasn't really an exaggeration, though. She gave him a small, cynical smile. Really, now? Young Per blushed. Really, he said quietly. And while we may not be near a barn, I do realize that we're in the trees, so I promise I will stay far, far away from you. I think you're safe. When I told my rector at the time that I was past doing that sort of a thing, he said that was good, because in my condition, Versa patted her belly, it'd be rather difficult to lure in anyone now, especially Salemites. But then he added he would have been amused to watch me try. Young Per grinned. Who was your rector? Anyone I know? Versa raised her eyebrows. I would think so. Pedo Shin. Ah, Young Per said, then didn't know what else to say. He was very easy to talk to, she said. He listened to my long descriptions without any expression of surprise or dismay, as if he'd heard it all before. No judgments, no criticisms, just patient listening. And that's the father you chose to abandon. Thank you for the reminder. So, what was the rest of that name they called me? The slashing what? The slashing sow, I'm sorry. Versa shook her head. I'm not. As I said before, they were all swine, so the title was fitting. To this day, I still refuse to eat pork. Whenever I see a ham, I feel the need to pull out my knife and stab the filthy animal. Young Per couldn't help but burst out in nervous laughter. She smiled forgivingly. When he recovered, Young Per said, I'm sorry you didn't have a father to protect you. She tossed her braid behind her. It's not as if he would ever come to my rescue. He encouraged that kind of behavior in his soldiers. Young Per guiltily remembered the daughters of Sargon and what the general had wanted him to do with them. She seemed to read his mind. Had he heard how I got my long knife in the first place, he likely would have berated the soldier for his failure, not his attempt. The general is selfish and brutal, and because he has power, his behavior is tolerated, venerated even. He nodded in sad agreement. How long did it take you to notice? She asked. Notice what? That he wasn't the inspired and brilliant leader he proclaimed himself to be? Several moons, he confessed. I was sucked in by the stories myself until I became one of those stories and had to realize all of it was fake, even down to his general's uniform. Well done, Versa said, to his astonishment. Most of the world will never notice the holes in his stories because their imaginations fill them in. They allow him to lead because they're thinking, if he can get away with this, then I can too. Every once in a while, someone steps back and thinks, this is wrong. Not that they have any power to fix any of it, but I like to believe there's some hope for them. So, is there any hope for me? Versa evaluated him critically as they slogged through the slushy patch. It's all up to you. Eventually, young Per said, May I ask you a question? Let me hear it first and then I'll decide if I'll answer. I was wondering, where's your husband now? Not anywhere near here, I'm sure. Then again, maybe he is. She wrinkled her nose. He may have come back with the army. Wait, he left Salem? Yes, he went back to the world with my youngest sister. But no one's supposed to go back to the world, young Per said, alarmed. Guide Zenas chased him all the way back to the canyon before Edge a few moons ago. Suddenly a memory came to young Per. A man and a girl, found in the forest above Edge. He closed his eyes and stopped walking. May I ask his name? Anoki Kaya, she said, not noticing he wasn't following. Young Per mouthed the words with her. Oh, Lieutenant Kaya, he breathed. Now, that makes sense. Lieutenant, Versa exclaimed, and stopped, realizing she was alone. He was never an officer. Oh, why am I surprised? Nothing he ever said was true. He might as well have been in the amphitheater for all the acting he ever did. He and his brother. Young Per had started walking to her, but stopped again. His brother? She continued again. Called himself Lick. Pretended to be a captain. Are you ever coming? Or am I walking to the ancient site alone after all? Young Per shook his head in amazement. Lick! The last word he said when the general killed him was Salem. Versa rolled her eyes. The general killed Lick? That figures. He killed the uncle of his unborn grandchild. You know, in Salem, that would be a tragedy. But it's just another day in the life of the Thorns. Wait! She grabbed his arm. Do you know what happened to my sister Priscilla? No one's heard from her since she ran back to the world with Anoki. He hesitated. I saw her briefly when they pulled her and Kaya from the forest. But after that, he shrugged. Yes, he was lying. Even though last night, when he was on his knees, he asked the Creator to help him to be honest in everything, he chose to lie. There had been already so much death, and young Per worried more to come. He needed Versa to be solid and steady on the rock face that afternoon. She'd be angry with him later for not telling her that Priscilla died from the herbs, but by then they'd be at the temple site, where she could grieve safely. Guide Zenas doesn't know either, Versa said flatly. Priscilla was barely 16, and running away with a married man 10 years her senior? Well, what do you think about my family now? We just get more deplorable by the hour, don't we? The words, it might not be only your family, formed in his head. Young Per watched her belly and wondered if he should tell her that Priscilla tried to talk to their father at the mansion. Her sobbing as Thorn sent her away was vivid in his mind. His cousin, perhaps, sobbing as she was sent away. I don't know what to say. Lick was the uncle of your baby? Kaya the father? She shrugged that off. She'll never meet them, fortunately. They'll have no influence in her life. I'll remind my baby that her heritage doesn't determine her actions. I like to think I'm proof of that. She turned to walk on, leaving young Pear to jog up to her. Do you know how Lick knew about Salem? He asked. I could never piece that together. Your father and I figured out a few things, Versa told him. A very kind and inspired man, your father is. She glanced accusingly at him. I know. So what did you figure out? Ever hear about someone called Wallachia? Sounds vaguely familiar, he said. From a while ago? He was a garter, Versa told him. Sent years ago to Edge to kill your father and aunt when they were small children. Zenas caught on, though, lured him to the forest, and had him abducted. Interestingly, he was the only garter who chose to try a life in Salem and didn't kill himself. I think I remember the story now, young Pear said. Wasn't he here for a while, then disappeared? He grew disaffected after a few years. Then suddenly one day, he was gone. Salem looked all over for him, assumed he died trying to reach the world, and that was that. But he made it to Scrub, Versa continued. Anoki told me about his father, how he always talked of 2 secret groups in the world, one of them ready to kill him if he revealed them, and another which would steal him away. His wife married him out of pity, and his sons were always embarrassed by his paranoia. But after he died, they began to feel they needed to vindicate him. Both Lick and Anoki tried the army and law enforcement, looking for evidence of secret groups. They knew the name of Salem from their father, and for years they looked for some way to find it, to prove their father wasn't the village idiot. When they found us, they assumed Salem would try to steal us away from the world, as their father said Salemites did. Sure enough, Salem did take us away, along with one of Wallachia's sons. Whoa, young Pear exhaled. Lick told the general about Salem, I'm sure of it. And Kaya is still down there somewhere. Yes, Versa sighed heavily. They knew the secret of Salem, but it didn't do them any good, did it? Lick is dead, and one of Salem's own told the general how to get here. Young Pear picked up on her accusation. It wasn't me, he insisted. I never revealed Salem. I was ready to die first. Versa regarded him blankly. Then who told him? Amory. And yes, she was a Salemite. She became his latest mistress, and she planned to be his queen. She told him all about Salem, but he killed her in the canyon before the last wall. Versa's mouth turned up into a vague smile, as if young Pear had just passed some kind of test. He suspected he'd been tested several times that day already. Glad to hear it. That it wasn't you, that is. Not that he killed her. But as I said, just another day in the life of the Thorns. She placed her hand on her hip where the long knife was secured. Yes, just another day. Now you keep giving the right answers or it'll be your last day, Shin. Young Pear chuckled, but Versa gave him a deliberate look that stopped him. There were moments when she favored the general a little too much. Maybe by dinner time, General, Major Twiggs said in a conciliatory manner. Maybe more soldiers will be willing to come back. Why should they? A lieutenant colonel said, sliding an empty plate on the large table, carefully so as not to disturb any of the plants spread out in the middle of it. He belched happily and patted his belly. Haven't had such a filling meal since Deceit Blue. Hey, he said as an idea occurred to him, and he turned to the other 15 men who had joined Thorn for their meal. It would have been decent of these Salemites to have offered us some of their surplus. I heard there are massive storehouses bursting with grain. They could have shared with us, you know. Poe Healy, sitting dully at the end of the table, perked up, and he watched General Thorn for a response. It likely was these very Salemites who had come down several moons ago, causing the tree fall above edge in order to offer a way to save them all. But feeding the world didn't fit into Lemuel Thorne's plans, and Poe watched him steadily as he concentrated on the sketched maps before him. The comment wasn't going to be acknowledged, nor would it be admitted that such an offer had once been made. Poe glanced at Twig to see if he'd put it together. The spindly man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, picking at the food offered freely to him last year. "If every kitchen in these houses is similarly stocked," said a major, licking his fingers, "what's to bring the soldiers back for dried rations and a bedroll in the cold? There are beds enough in these empty houses for everyone." The men were exchanging jars, no longer concerned about tomorrow's attack, but commenting to each other on the wonders of smashed apples and strawberry sauce, which they sopped up with hard bread. Healy stared blankly at a large bowl of mixed nuts on the table. "Poe," the general said, "recommendations." He shrugged. "Whatever you want to do, General. Salem seems to be yours." "The soldiers seem to think so too," said a captain. "I saw one man and his woman selecting their house already. There's another couple arguing with someone else over a larger house west of here." Another major held out his hands. "Arguing? There's plenty out there. They could have 2 houses each if they moved fast enough." Poe sighed. "Ugh, they'll never be satisfied." Every man at the table looked at him. "They can find the biggest house and still look over the entire valley and imagine they were cheated. They won't even pay for it. They'll just take it. Like the food, like the animals, but none of it will be enough," Poe said in disgust. "They're insatiable, just like after the first pox outbreak decades ago. Every village was fighting for the possessions of the dead. We don't even have the decency to wait until these people are dead. We're robbing them now." "Spoils of war," one captain insisted. We deserve nothing, Captain," Poe exploded, tired of pretending he agreed with any of this. "How have we deserved anything? Invading? Killing? That somehow makes us worthy? All we do is take. When is it enough?" He threw his plate on the table, scattering the pages. "I've had enough." "Yes, you have, Healy," said Thorne brusquely. But Poe didn't care. He stood up and strode out of the station, ignoring the shouts of General Thorne to return. He trotted down the stairs and over to the barn, noticing the sky. It was blue. "With white," he told himself. "Blue with white. Don't ignore the white." Inside the barn, he lay down on the straw like an animal. He spent the next hour arguing with himself about the nature of the sky. It was much simpler when he was 6. "What color is the sky, Poe? See that it's not what they've told you it is. What color is the sky, Poe?" Yes, the sky was blue, occasionally. But maybe the blue was just an illusion, and the sky really was black, with stars in it all the time except when the sun came out and outshined everything else, demanding all the attention, changing what everyone saw, casting shadows and illuminating crevices and altering everyone's perceptions. Maybe that was the whole problem, Poe considered. Everyone sees the blue, but the blue's not real. What the sky was doing every minute of every day and night, that was what was critical to observe. And no one in the entire world bothered to see what the sky was really doing. She tried to teach him that when he was 6. He was more stupid now than when he was a small child. Poe held his head and wept like that child. And that is the end of part 2 of 5 of chapter 6, the 35th day of planting. Thank you.